Justin Ford for From the Frontline. Tonight we will be discussing the extraordinary life and legacy of veteran pioneer missionary to Muslims, Gerhard Nehls. In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Dr. Hammond, who was Gerhard Nehls?
Well, he's a pioneer missionary to Muslims and author of a lot of pioneering books on Islam. He's a board member of Frontline Fellowship and the founder of Life Challenge, which later became Life Challenge Africa. And Gerhard Nehls has now finished his race and is with Jesus. He went into glory this last Saturday.
Dr. Hammond, can you please give us more of the background of this pioneer missionary? For instance, where did he come from?
Well, he is born in Germany near Magdeburg, 29th of April, 1928. And he passed eternity this last Saturday, the 3rd of May, in Brisbane, Australia. And he spent most of his life actually in South Africa, working as a missionary here to Muslims, but his children and grandchildren were in Australia, so he moved there. Many of his children end up as missionaries in, for example, the Philippines and India, and it turned out that Australia was the best place for him to spend his last years with his grandchildren. So he was 97 years old, which is phenomenal innings, and he's survived by his wife, Hannelore, his children, Volker and Andrea, Petra, Matthias and Stefan, their families, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I've actually lost track of how many great-grandchildren he's got. So Gerhard Nehls is the last surviving combat veteran of the Second World War that I personally know. I know that there may be some others who are still alive, but of someone who actually fought in the Second World War, Gerhard Nehls is the last personal friend that I know who was a surviving veteran. So 80 years ago, as a child, Gerhard Nehls was experiencing the 1,000 bomber raids which devastated Berlin and 63 other cities of Germany. And as a 15-year-old, Gerhard enlisted and was fighting in the Air Force, in the air defense, that is, as a Luftwaffenhelfer, or, he is helping to load and support the bombardiers on anti-aircraft guns like the 88. But he operated the Vierling, which is particularly what we call a quad, the four-barreled anti-aircraft gun, at 4 different locations in Germany. But at just age 17 years old, Gerhard was fighting in the Battle for Berlin, one of the biggest battles in history, in which he is given a Panzerfaust, which is the prototype for the RPG, which we all know pretty well, but this is a primitive version of it. And he is sent out to hunt Soviet T-34s. There were swarms of these tanks pouring into Berlin with the invading Red Army. I mean, there's millions of soldiers and thousands of T-34 tanks coming in, so it was a target-rich environment. And the 17-year-old was crawling around the rubble of Berlin, taking out Russian T-34 tanks. Very brave man. Well, after the war, at age 17, he escaped the Soviet net, and at age 17, he is arrested for what the Soviets called subversive activities, which Uncle Gerhard described as small acts of resistance to the communist occupiers or invaders of East Germany. So for these subversive activities, Gerhard was condemned to forced labor camps, and this included incarceration in Ketzendorf, Frauenfurchen, and the infamous Buchenwald. In these concentration camps, he suffered for 4 years from August 1945 till January 1950. And almost 60% of the inmates perished of starvation and ill treatment in these camps. So this traumatic experience led him to the first time in his life seriously consider eternity, creation, and God. And Gerhard prayed a simple prayer, basically the Lord's Prayer, as much as he could remember of it. And by the grace of God, Gerhard survived the Soviet death camps. And that's extraordinary. When I asked him about his upbringing, he said there was no prayer in any Christianity in his home. He never went to church except once for a wedding. He never saw the inside of a Sunday school in his upbringing. And his schooling, he doesn't recall any scripture or prayer in school either. So he grew up, like myself, ignorant of anything to do with the Word of God or Christianity. And during his time of incarceration, his father died, and it seemed far too dangerous to remain any longer in East Germany. So he escaped across the Iron Curtain to West Berlin, where he began training as a goldsmith at the Meisterschule für Kunsthandwerk. And that's where he met his future wife, Hannelore, in West Berlin.
How did he come to be in South Africa then?
Well, shortly after his marriage and completion of his training, Gerhard moved to Johannesburg. You heard that quite a few Germans had moved to South Africa for a better life, and there was quite a strong community of Germans in South Africa. And he was told he'd have better prospects and better chance of a freer life, because it was extremely oppressive immediately after the war in Germany, not only in the eastern but in the western side too, and they were still being crushed and occupied very much as an occupied country, and therefore it was thought if he came out to Africa he'd have a chance for a better life. And so he came out first, and he had a job as a goldsmith in Johannesburg, and then a few months later his wife Hannelore came when he was able to have had a home established. And when they were in South Africa, they were invited to attend a series of prophecy meetings at a Brethren Church service. And being interested in making sense of history, what on earth just happened to us, and current affairs, they were determined to attend. And there were quite a few interesting things on the go, and it looked like the world could end, nuclear arms race and the Cold War and war in Korea. And so he wanted to know, when's Armageddon? And so out of interest in these lectures, he wouldn't have gone to a normal church service, but going to a church to hear prophecy lectures interested his wife and himself. And the messianic prophecy of Isaiah 53 made a particular impact on Gerhard, and he became aware that he is guilty before a holy God. Now, the lectures on the fulfilled prophecies convinced both Hannelore and Gerhard the Bible is authoritative, the Bible is supernatural, the Bible cannot be explained in human ways. How could it have predicted in such great detail ahead of time these momentous historic events that they had been living through? And so he was convinced that the Bible is true, and then he is convinced that God is holy and he's a sinner, and that he's guilty before a holy God. And so he recognized his need. I need pardon from Almighty God. He's the eternal judge. I need freedom through Jesus Christ, through his atonement on the cross. And as a result of their conversion to Christ, they were also called to missions. On the 28th of March, 1958, both Gerhard and Hannelore, as he described it individually and together, decided to surrender their lives to Christ and to follow Jesus.
There seems to be some parallels to your testimony, Dr. Hammond. No wonder you got on so well with Gerhard Nehls.
Yes, he mentioned that in his introduction to my Behind Enemy Lines for Christ book, that we both came from very secular backgrounds, unchurched, and that we were convicted of our sin and before a holy God. And it was as though the first time I heard the gospel was back in 1977 when I attended that outreach in a cinema. And so Gerhard Nehls' testimony resonates with me because I also recognize I'm a hell-deserving sinner, answerable to a holy God, and that I need to surrender my life to Christ. Also the fact that my call to missions and conversion came together, and that was experience of both Gerhard and Hannelore Nehls. And he said he was struck by the fact that he realized one of the examples had been given in the lectures by the guest speaker, who is Les Rainley, was about Cornelius, the Roman centurion who was converted. And he recognized that his name Nehls comes from the word Cornelius. So there's a connection in the name. And he felt he is also like Cornelius, being called upon to surrender his life to Christ. So, yes, I've resonated with Gerhard Nehls from the beginning. We both had a similar way of looking at things, and we just clicked.
So how did he get involved in missions then?
Well, the night of his conversion, he met with the guest speaker who had proclaimed the gospel to him. That's Les Rainley and his wife Audrey. They came to their home, and while they were talking, they talked through the night. And in the morning, as the sun was rising, Les Rainley and his wife Audrey drove off for Lusaka, Northern Rhodesia, what today is Zambia. And so they maintained a vigorous correspondence, and soon Gerhard and Hannelore received an invitation from Les and Audrey. Why don't you come up to Northern Rhodesia and help us? And so Gerhard and Hannelore decided to respond, and he described that he got his old Chevrolet, which had a loading deck built into the trunk area, so some kind of innovation, turning it into a almost pickup truck bakkie. And and fitted with 4 different types and sizes of tires, which he acquired secondhand. So he wasn't getting the newest and the best. He was getting what he could afford and what was available. So imagine driving with a car with 4 different types of tires and sizes, and they drove through the magnificent northern Transvaal, across the Limpopo River, through Bulawayo, which is where I was brought up, and through southern Rhodesia to the mighty Zambezi River, and they crossed the spectacular Victoria Falls at the Victoria Falls Bridge into northern Rhodesia, and he said they even felt the spray of the waterfall Musuatanya as they crossed the bridge. And they crossed into northern Rhodesia and celebrated Christmas Eve in a tent by the side of the dirt road, surrounded by wild animals, and then arrived the next day, Christmas Day, in Lusaka at their host Les and Audrey Rainley's house. And they spent a few days enjoying Lusaka and celebrating Christmas. And while their children and wives remained behind in Lusaka, Les and Gerhard then began the long journey north for ministry in the Copperbelt, which to me is like half a day's drive today, but back then it was several days' drive. And they went to the Copperbelt of northern Rhodesia, to the Belgian Congo, and to Portuguese West Africa, what today is Angola. And he described how they walked amongst people whose lifestyle had not changed in centuries. He said probably hadn't changed in the last 1,000 years. You know, living in mud huts, thatched roofs, all the water comes from the river for cooking, washing, drinking. Everything's made in open fires, and the people living very primitive lives, and the power of witchcraft and superstition was pervasive, and they recognized they were ministering in kind of cultures that would have not changed much since the days of David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley. When they had to enter the Congo, they were informed the border official was away, and they should just help themselves to whatever stamps they needed for their passports in the top drawer of the only desk in the customs office. I mean, can you imagine? After this, the boom was lifted, and they were welcomed into the Belgian Congo, and there's a Belgian flag flying on a wooden flagpole. They crossed flooded rivers. They saw spectacular herds of wildlife. They met very interesting people, experienced diverse cultures, and they survived numerous adventures. And after this mission, incredibly, they offered their services to the mission organization by letter, but never received a reply. I mean, what that mission missed out on, I mean, a phenomenal man, but God, of course, had another plan. But it does remind us that we must be more vigorous in answering correspondence. Well, after that, Gerhard and Hannelore were led to concentrate on sharing the gospel with people they could easily relate to, German immigrants and students and Jewish people in the Johannesburg area. And they particularly got involved in an intense study of the Old Testament, the Torah, to learn how to reach Jewish people for Christ. And that was his first big emphasis. So he really chose tough mission fields, you know. Jewish people, witchcraft followers, and later Muslims, of course.
Yeah. Uncle Gerhard was best known for his work amongst the Muslims in Cape Town. How did he come to focus on the Muslim evangelism?
Well, while they were in Johannesburg, they were actually asked by a Canadian missionary who has been transferred from Joburg to work amongst the Zulus in Natal, will you take over my children's ministry? And that had several townships where they had Bible study groups, and so Gerhard and Hannelore accepted this challenge, and they developed a vigorous youth ministry which was called the Bible Band. And for 10 years, they were working in the Johannesburg area, in the townships around, with the Bible Band having profound influence, a major impact on the lives of hundreds of young people who were living in the townships around Johannesburg. They had school clubs, they had youth clubs, they had Bible evenings, they had Bible evening schools, so a Bible school in the evenings, adventure camps, and they drew large numbers of young people who were open to God's word. And it was primarily a teaching ministry because Gerhard identified himself as primarily a teacher. And that's really what he was. He was a man who could teach, and so Bible studies were his primary work. But in 1975, he is led to move to Cape Town. There was another missionary who was saying, we have been praying for so many years for a missionary to go to Cape Town. He said, what would Cape Town need with the gospel? Cape Town must be one of the most evangelized countries in all of Africa, which is true. But he is told, no, but you see, there's the Cape Malay, and there's not a single church amongst them. Boerkaap, or what was then called the Malay Quarter, had 13 mosques, but not a single church. And there was no known Christian in that area. So in the midst of these evangelized people in the Cape was an unreached people group. And he found it hard to believe, how could the people of Cape Town be insensible to people who haven't heard the gospel living in their midst? And so he came to Cape Town with the goal, because when the evangelist said, we've been praying for a missionary to reach the Muslims in Cape Town, he thought, but I'm not an evangelist, I'm a teacher. But then it was impressed upon him, well, who needs teaching? And who's open teaching? Well, the Christians. If I can train the Christians as to how to reach the Muslims in Cape Town, then the churches in Cape Town will adopt different parts of the Muslim communities, and we'll see the Great Commission fulfilled. He just needs to be an enabler. And as he said, his greatest disappointment was how unresponsive the Christians were. Gerhard had no problem reaching Muslims. Almost every door he knocked on, the Muslims would open the door and welcome you, come in, have some tea and sit down and serve cakes and cupcakes and biscuits and so on. And they would discuss religion enthusiastically. And I experienced that too with him. But first he had to study Islam and the Quran, of course. And the problem was, he said, the Muslims would listen to him, but the Christians wouldn't. There was absolute apathy amongst the churches in Cape Town, if not hostility and opposition to the challenge that they should get involved in Muslim evangelism. And to understand the time, at that time, the Islamic Propagation Center was growing. Its famous, or should I say infamous leader, Ahmadiyyat, was causing a lot of trouble between Christians and Muslims. Ahmadiyyat was producing provocative, insulting, often blasphemous publications which aimed to discredit the Bible, to deny the crucifixion, and to deny the divinity of Christ. And it had become evident soon that God was truly guiding him to redirect his mission focus, because after centuries of obscurity and lethargy even, radical Islam was suddenly experiencing a resurgence, even a revival, which to a large extent was probably caused by the state of Israel being inserted in the Middle East, which created a real revival of Islam and a sense of we've been defiled and we've got these Jews in the Middle East. And so Islamic jihad was spreading. And then the Shah's Iran was betrayed by Jimmy Carter into the hands of Ayatollah Khomeini. And so revolutionary Shia Muslims from Iran were spreading out across the globe with an aggressive message. And this was, and I've met some of these people in Durban and Cape Town at the Islamic Propagation Center, even in Wynberg Mosque. So there's no doubt that Iran's message has reached this far. And so Gerhard Nehls came in at the very cusp of the wave of this tidal wave. And this new manifestation of Islam and jihad was hitting news headlines, even the streets worldwide. You could no longer ignore Islam, because Islam is now the motivating force behind most of the terrorist hijackings of aircraft and bombs and all kinds of things on the go of the wars. And he looked at Islam as the largest competitor to Christianity. It's the second largest religion in the world, the largest opponent to Christianity. After communism, Islam was persecuting the church the most, and now, since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's the biggest persecuted church. And he also recognized the Muslims are the largest group of unreached people in the world. So at that time, very little in the way of Christian research and books on Islam existed. When Gerhard was speaking to Christian churches in Cape Town about the need to evangelize the Muslims, and the people would say, well, what material is there that we can use? And what, are these tracts useful amongst the Muslims? No, they're not. Most things designed for Christians had terms like Trinity and Son of God, terms that Muslims were predisposed to resist and reject. And so Gerhard actually led the way in pioneering Christian research and innovation into mobilizing Christians to respond to the challenge of Islam and reach their Muslim neighbors, fellow students, co-workers for Christ. So both Gerhard and Hannelore spent many months researching and studying the Quran and other Muslim manuscripts. He said, I didn't even know that the Hadith existed. And so he had to start learning about the Hadith. And they studied any works by Orientalists and prior century Christian missionaries like Samuel Zwemmer, who was one of the very pioneers of missionary work to the Muslims. He even went to Saudi Arabia. So Samuel Zwemmer was a good source for him. But Gerhard Nehls found it was absolutely essential that he first do good research. And so he produced landmark books, which still are textbooks for many people. Christians Answer Muslims, Christians Ask Muslims, The Great Commission, You and the Muslims. And this trilogy was foundational and required reading in our mission in the early days. And then he wrote the book Dear Abdullah, which is a series of correspondences with a Muslim who's interested in learning more about the Bible. And Al-Kitab, which is a Bible study for new converts, for Muslims to understand the Bible, Al-Kitab. Then your book, my book, a topical comparison of the Quran and the Bible. And we use this to go into mosques and Islamic propagation centers to have Bible studies. So you tell us what the Quran teaches us on God, man, sin, salvation, heaven, hell, and you have the study, and they'll give this what the Quran teaches, and we have this what the Bible teaches. And so he propagated these excellent manuals to help us. He also wrote books like Basic Aspects of Islam, Christian Islamic Controversy, Practical Tactical Approach to Missions, Reach Out, Premises and Principles in Muslim Evangelism. And he wrote, one of his last books was Life is a Challenge, More So in Africa. And along with a slew of gospel tracts and leaflets, all of which were foundational for many subsequent authors who ventured into trying to understand Islam and develop an effective Christian approach to teaching Muslims for Christ. So it's not just that he pioneered missionary work amongst Muslims, but he pioneered a lot of the books that really have exploded in recent years. But most people who are writing about Islam today are building on the foundational research of Gerhard Nehls.
How did you come into contact with Uncle Gerhard, Dr. Hammond?
Well, it's through these very vital books that I first made contact with him back in 1982. Christians Ask Muslims and Christians Answer Muslims was foundational for me, and I already felt a great burden to reach Muslims. And so when I read these books, I wanted to get hold of the author, who at that stage was living in Lakeside near Takai, and I was able to go through and meet him then. And I've many great vivid memories of traveling with Uncle Gerhard and with Walter Erica's co-worker to Boerkaap, what we then called the Malay Quarter. It's on the slopes of Signal Hill, and learning from how he interacted with the Muslims over tea and his emphasis on the parables of Jesus. And particularly, two men went up to the temple to pray. You know, one a religious leader, I thank you God, I'm not like other men. I fast twice a week, I give 1/10 to the poor. I'm not like that tax collector over there. And then there's this secular tax collector who's way at the back corner of the church. He, unlike the Pharisee, who's right in the front of the temple praying, and he's just beating his chest saying, God have mercy on me, a sinner. Which one was right in God's sight? And every time the people say, well, the religious leader, of course. And Uncle Gerhard would hand the Bible over to him and say, but that's not what Jesus said. And they'd be absolutely shocked. How could the Lord say that this wicked tax collector, he's the one who went away righteous in God's sight? And the religious leader is said to be praying to himself. God was not impressed with his litany of self-congratulation and his pious fraud of patting himself on the back and blowing his own trumpet. And so I've often used the very same words and stories that I heard from Uncle Gerhard, not just this story, but many others. And I had learned them back in the early 1980s, but all through my subsequent outreaches throughout Africa with Muslims, I found two men went up to the temple to pray, an excellent parable of Christ to start with.
Did Muslims come to Christ through this work of Gerhard Nehls?
Well, without a doubt, yes. And there's a few interesting testimonies. Now, of course, the one thing you'd want to know is what's the best way to bring Muslims to Christ? And Uncle Gerhard was very strong in saying there's no one way. This is spiritual warfare. It's like there's no one magic bullet, magic weapon, magic tactic that wins every battle, every war. You've got to really study. You've got to know yourself. You've got to know your enemy. You've got to know your weapons. You've got to look at the different tactics, and you need everything. So he says literature has an important place, but literature is not something that you can use instead of prayer, nor can prayer be something you use instead of personal evangelism. You need both. So by way of example, he speaks of a Muslim who found a Bible on a train. Now the Bible is said to be corrupted by many Muslims, not that the Quran says it is. In fact, the Quran says you must study the people of the book, ask of them, and that the Torah of Moses, the Zabur of David, and the Injil of Jesus, or Nabi, so the prophet Jesus, are the word of God. And so he picked it up. It's a holy book. You can't just leave it lying on train. And then at home he got more and more curious, so he started to read it, but he didn't understand what he's reading. So he puts it to one side. The Bible on its own was not going to convert this man. But next thing at work, he sees a fellow colleague sitting down during lunchtime reading his Bible. So he walks over and says, "Are you a Christian?" "Yes." "Can you please explain to me the Bible?" He says, "I've got a Bible, I've tried to read, but I just don't understand what I'm reading." So this man starts to explain to him, and the man came to Christ. So you can see a combination between literature evangelism and person evangelism was essential. Then there's people who've had dreams and they don't understand their dreams. And he had a lady, he came to her and she said, "I had this dream of a man dressed like a shepherd, and he had a whole lot of stones in his hand and he had a sling." And she said, "Can you interpret this dream for me?" He says, "Well, I can tell you that must be David, the shepherd boy who became the king, and with his stones that God used to bring down Goliath." And so she says, "I've got so many giants in my life that I need to defeat. And can you pray for my healing?" She needed healing. And he found Muslims who came to Christ by helping to interpret dreams and by helping to pray for them when they're going through trouble and health issues and being able to be healed. So there were people who got healed and were converted. And then there's people who came to him asking him to pray for their daughter who was demon-possessed or son, and they got delivered and then they got converted. And then he's saying how there's one of these women who had come to Christ, and she would share the gospel with her husband. Her husband was a very hard, very traditional man. He would beat her up regularly whenever she mentioned the gospel or the Bible or Jesus. And so one day she really had seen something really magnificent in the Bible, and she couldn't help herself but to share it with her husband, but she knew, "I'm probably going to get beaten up for this." So she prepared a special meal, and he thinks she also prepared dessert, but he can't remember exactly if she did that. And she, after feeding him, said, "Now, please don't get angry at me, but I want to share with you something that I discovered today in the Bible." And he shared with her, and he got up so angry, and he started to hit her, kick her, beat her to the ground, and he tore her Bible out of her hands and was kicking it. And while he's doing this, there's a knock on the door. A Life Challenge team was coming to share the gospel. And so he threw her into the bedroom, shut the door, kicking the Bible in before he shut the door with her. And then you can imagine how convicted this man is. He's just been beating his wife for sharing the Bible, and now people are going to come and sit down politely to share the gospel with him. And then there's another amazing example. He had correspondence with a Muslim imam who was based in Malawi. And this Muslim imam was very intrigued, wanting to know, how do I understand more of the gospel? And he's asking questions, and he's having dreams. And Gerhard Nehls says that correspondence can be very useful. He started correspondence with following up people that he could not be with because they're now in another country. But this correspondence, you can actually get hold of a lot of this. He published a book called Dear Abdullah. Well, there's a story about Abdullah, who was the head of the Islamic Propagation Center in Malawi. And so he has this long correspondence backwards and forwards. And at one point, it's quite clear Abdullah's convinced, he gets converted, he gets baptized from some local church. And Gerhard is inspired to travel up to Malawi. But when he gets there and he asks, has anyone seen Abdullah? Nobody's seen. He goes to the Islamic Propagation Center. It's closed down. Even the sign's been ripped down. And it turns out, asking around, and the Muslims don't want to talk about it, but when their imam was converted, they stormed and mobbed the mosque and, the Islamic Propagation Center, destroyed it, and he fled. And it was believed he was abducted. And for years, Gerhard heard nothing. What's happened to Abdullah? Has he been killed? What happened? Well, he found out years later that the man had fled all the way to Denmark and had gotten religious refugee status and was living and growing safely in Denmark. So that's a man who was once an Islamic propagation center head and missionary. And you can benefit from that correspondence, although the Dear Abdullah books, which is in German, it's in English, I think it's in Danish too, it's in Afrikaans, and so you can read it in different languages. The Dear Abdullah is a slightly fictionalized, but it's based on these actual correspondences that he had, which resulted in the conversion of one of his imams. So there's another case he mentions where there was a young Muslim girl who came to Christ and asked him to come to her home when she told her family about her decision. And the parents were in a state of shock after she said, I've been studying the Bible and I'm convinced that the Injil of Jesus is the truth, and therefore I've given my life to Jesus. And the mother was furious and said, you go into your room, you pack your bags and you leave, and this man now is your father. We no longer have a daughter. And so Uncle Gerrit tried very hard to reason with him, to give her a chance to let her explain, and they let her explain, probably because there was this foreigner there that they were respecting, and but they still kicked her out. And he said he had some pretty sad experiences of Muslims coming to Christ, having trouble being accepted in some churches. Some churches were quite excited to have a Muslim convert immediately, and they got a lot of attention for the first few minutes. But then the people would forget, and you'd be like yesterday's hero, and suddenly there's no more invitations to homes, and people aren't even talking to you in the church. And, many of them got discouraged and lonely. I mean, they've lost their own families. They've been kicked out of their own homes and communities. Their own sister or brother or father's not going to talk to them. And so some of them were quite discouraged, and he came across some who backslid and went all the way back to Islam because they felt that they were they didn't have any equivalent level of fellowship amongst the Christians. Others were just never accepted in the church, and there were some churches that said, we don't want any trouble, and so we don't want a convert from Islam here. And that reminds me that when I got death threats from Islamic governments for my missionary work, I was actually told by one church that I must leave. And the pastor said, but your family can stand. And the rest of the deacons said, no, they've all got to leave. We don't want any Hammonds here. And there'd been death threats against me. And the church said they were afraid of getting some petrol bomb coming through their stained glass windows. And so I'm sure some of these Muslim converts also had the situation where some churches told them to leave. So he definitely had people who came to Christ, and he definitely had some good responses. But there were a lot of discouragements too, when he worked long and hard for months and years, and to have somebody saying, I would rather drink a cupful of maggots than accept your gospel. And so there were the resistance examples, but then there were people where they were converted, but in many cases they literally had to adopt them. And some of our friends like Volker and Crystal Geschwantner, they literally ended up adopting people who'd been thrown out of their homes. So their family grew dramatically. In addition to their own son and daughter, they had a whole lot of Muslim background believer adopted sons and daughters as well. And when I'd go to the home, I'd meet a whole lot of them, and shame these people they'd lost everything. So yes, Muslims did come to Christ. And he said at the beginning, he actually did a study to work out how many people there were in Burkop and how long it would take him to reach them. And, basically each convert was roughly an 8-year project. 8 years of discussions and clarifying and removing misunderstandings. And he said, it's not a quick fix. It's not like one trick track's going to bring them to salvation. That only happens in a movie sort of thing. There's relationships get built up. And then there's still some who fall back, and you've got to go further. So, of course, some get murdered. Some people have to flee. Some have to go to another country. So it's a tough work. So he works out that it would take him 180 years to evangelize everyone in Burkop. And he said, but then I realized I'm not going to be here in 180 years' time, and neither are they. So he says, well, if you've got a job that will take one man 100 years, well, if you get 100 men, you could get it done in 1 year. So he said, obviously, the only solution was to train, to mobilize, to multiply, to have a training of trainers, a ministry of multiplication, to get many churches in Cape Town to train their people to mobilize that every church is taking the Muslims in their area. Every person is thinking about the Muslim in their workplace or in their school or their neighborhood, and that you have got thousands of Christians in Cape Town all working together independently, but with the same goal of bringing the gospel to Muslims. And they're Muslims throughout the Western Cape. And back then, there was something like 120,000 Muslims in Cape Town. I mean, right now, it's many hundreds of thousands. So the number of Muslims is increasing, but not enough evangelists and disciples. So that's where his vision came from. Life challenge was to challenge Christians to reach the Muslims. And he said he had more success with reaching Muslims personally than he had with persuading other Christians to come. And while I was a theological student, I used to give my Monday nights to going with Uncle Gerhard to Burkhop, and we'd walk door to door and have conversations with people. And sometimes you'd spend the whole evening just speaking to one family or one individual. And on other occasions, you might have 5 families you can visit and share something and leave some literature with them and pray with them even. But you wouldn't have a long, in-depth conversation. Many Muslim families would welcome you in, if not all of them, and they'd be polite and they'd let you share what you want to share. But asking in-depth questions is less common. But there was one very exciting story that he told me of a woman, a mother, a wife who, when he arrived at the door, she said, and he had been there many a time over the years, she said she wanted the whole family together. She called her children out and her husband, all sitting in the lounge. And then she asked some tough questions of him. And he thought, well, she's getting ready to, basically attack him. Maybe she's been reading Ahmadiyya. That's a kind of combat kit to deal with Bible thumpers. And so, quote unquote. And she at a certain point came to, I've studied the Word of God clearly. I've read what you've sent. I've done research. I've gone to the Quran. And I've decided the Bible is the truth. Jesus is the Savior. He's the Messiah. And I'm giving my life to Jesus Christ. In front of her husband, in front of her children. And they all seemed to be in agreement with her and impressed. And there was no opposition expressed in that specific family at that time. So, you do get these wonderful victories here and there. But of course, there's thousands of disappointments in between. And he was very patient and persistent to have seen these people brought to the Lord. One of his people had an interesting project, and that was going to the airport and looking planes. This is particularly up in Joburg. I'm actually jumping ahead of myself. When he moved back to Johannesburg, and he saw there's a whole lot of planes coming in from Dubai and from different, Cairo, Algiers, and so on. And so they'd see the timing of the people coming through and be alert that somebody, evidently Muslims, coming through the door, and whoever's meant to greet him isn't there, and this poor guy's left in a strange place and he's wandering the airport. And they'd be open to that and then go and approach a person, help him get transport, accommodation, and so on. And in this way, often the people, they're away from their family and their support structure, and they're in a strange country, and some kindness and hospitality shown by a person there. And there were quite a lot of Muslims who came to Christ in that way. So that's another strategy which was interesting.
How did Uncle Gerhard come to have such a wide, worldwide ministry?
Well, Gerhard mobilized and trained teams in Cape Town for door-to-door and personal literature evangelism. And he got quite a number of families coming from, especially Germany, to join. And Uli Lehmann is one that I remember, but Volker and Crystal Geschwantner were good friends of mine. And so he felt he could leave Cape Town in their hands. And he decided to move back to Johannesburg and Transvaal because there's so many Indian and Pakistani Muslims living, especially in Lenasia. And at this time, when he moved back to Joburg to start a new work for the Transvaal Muslims, he founded Christian Concern for Muslims, or CCM. And the goal was to bring together all workers amongst Muslims countrywide. So, for example, it's tied up with John Gilchrist, who's also visited our mission here and spoken at one of our Muslim evangelism workshops. And John Gilchrist was a lawyer from Benoni who had a very different approach. He would have debates, mainly public debates. And being a lawyer, he had a very good mind. And I attended some of his debates, and I must say I learned from John Gilchrist too. He's written also some good books. And so they teamed up, and a whole lot of other groups. So they brought some disparate entities who were concerned for Muslims into one network, Christian Concern for Muslims. And then he also saw the need to merge Life Challenge Africa with SIM. Now, SIM used to be known as the Society for, the Sudan Interior Mission. Originally it was Sudan Interior Mission, and it later became the Society for International Missions, as it amalgamated with, I think, the Andes Mission in South America, and became more international and then got more of an Asian angle. So SIM went from Sudan Interior Mission to Society for International Missions. And he took Life Challenge Africa and joined what was then probably one of the biggest missions in the world. So Life Challenge Africa was able to benefit from a much bigger organization, but also empower that whole organization to be more effective in Muslim evangelism. It was an inspired idea. And he undertook a mission to Tanzania. And then in 1987, Gerhard participated in the first SIM COME. And COME stands for Consultation on Muslim Evangelism. This was held in Monrovia, Liberia, and they developed a strategy for Muslim evangelism in sub-Saharan Africa. Very ambitious. And so again, he's getting more strategic. I've got a limited lifespan. I can't reach all the Muslims, but I can help train more people, ministry of multiplication. So he called this training of trainers, ministry of multiplication. And in 1988, Gerhard conducted the first Muslim evangelism seminar on the island of Mauritius. And that also had him deviate a bit to learning how to evangelize Hindus, because that's most of the population of Mauritius. And then he participated in Lausanne too. That's the 1988 Philippines Lausanne Congress, one of the biggest world missions conferences ever. And he conducted Muslim evangelism workshops, not just for the Lausanne conference, but then for leaders in Malawi, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. Very busy year, 1988. 1990, that was most of those workshops in Malawi, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. In 1991, Gerhard Nehls was invited to begin lecturing at the Haggai Institute for Advanced Leadership at Singapore. Very high level of missionary training. Only the best get invited to be lecturers there. And in 1992, at the age of 65, Gerhard Nehls handed over the leadership of Life Challenge Africa to Volker, who was then based in Nairobi, Kenya. And Gerhard had no intention of retiring, but constitutionally he is required to retire at least the leadership of the ministry over. Well, he continued writing and lecturing worldwide. And he even got invitations to lecture at the Haggai Institute in Hawaii and at the Zwemmer Institute in California, named after Samuel Zwemmer, the pioneer missionary to Muslims.
How can our listeners benefit from the ministry of Gerhard Nehls, Dr. Hammond? Where can we learn more, and where can we obtain some of his writings and teaching/training materials?
Well, by God's grace, Uncle Gerhard has produced The Message of Nabi Isa, which at one time was a book, but now he's got as a video, as a PowerPoint and audiovisual presentation. We set up a website for him on his request, The Message of Nabi Isa. Now, Nabi means prophet, and Isa is the term for Jesus in the Quran, so the message of Nabi Isa means the message of the prophet Jesus, but using the Arabic terminology that a Muslim would be familiar with. So the Message of Nabi Isa is a website page to introduce Muslims to the Messiah. And it's given in the language and even accent that Muslims will identify as not foreign, but their own. And so it represents the best synthesis of his years of ministry. And so his vision is to mobilize an army of Christians worldwide to sign up and step through the open door that we have in social media in particular. He wants us to unite in prayer and to engage in personal interaction with Muslims, whether it's someone you know at work or someone you travel with on the bus or the train, or someone you just meet at a marketplace, or maybe the shopkeeper you interact with regularly, or on social media even. But by people understanding how to communicate the gospel in a way that Muslims can understand without unnecessary stumbling blocks and misunderstandings. So the Message of Nabi Isa is a website you can link and share with your Muslim friends or contacts, and it would be www.themessageofnabi.org. So that's the website. And also the website of the missionary set up Life Challenge is www.lifechallenge-challenge life-challenge.org. So www.life-challenge.org has a lot of great resources of Gerhard, Walter, Eric, Uli Newman, and other of the Life Challenge team. And we've got all of the books of Gerhard Nehls at our Christian Liberty Books, so christianlibertybooks.co.za. We will be having more of Uncle Gerhard's materials uploaded onto our website, particularly the William Carey Bible Institute materials. He donated his resources very generously that we could make available for our tertiary education program online, williamcareybi.org. And so we've got a whole Muslim evangelism series of materials there. And so he's provided us with a wealth of material, a treasure trove of resources. And Gerhard Nehls has not just been an invaluable mentor, friend, honored member of the board of Frontline Fellowship for many years. He even wrote the introduction to my book, Frontline, Behind Enemy Lines for Christ. And at our mission, we take it as a sacred duty before God to ensure that the important research, these resources of Gerhard Nehls, both his hard copies and his digital research and libraries, are protected and preserved, made available to Bible-believing Christians worldwide, all those who dedicate to evangelism and discipleship, particularly to Muslims. And to this end, we are helping to set up right now, along with his family team, including children and grandchildren, Delighted to Share. He often spoke about being delighted to share. And so the name of this website we're setting up is called Delighted to Share, where we'll have all of his writings, all of his audios, all of his videos, all of his materials, such as The Battle for the Heart, a treasure trove of resources, his study notes, manuals, lecture notes, for those who want to understand Islam and know how to evangelize Muslims. So Delighted to Share is going to be up and running soon as the family can get all the material scanned and digitized and uploaded. But the messageofnabiisa.org is available now. You can get a lot of his materials on our William Carey Bible Institute, but we'll have links for this on the Frontline Mission website. If you go onto frontlinemissionsa.org, we'll have links to all the audio and visuals that we can get of Gerhard Nehls, as well as the bookshop where you can get more of his different books like Christians Ask Muslims, Christians Answer Muslims, and of course going on to life-challenge.org website.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hammond, for giving us this tribute to Gerhard Nehls. In closing, I'd like to read from Philippians chapter 1, verse 21. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Thank you very much for joining us from the front line. God bless and good night.